There are some groups in both Africa and Asia that willingly cooperated with Europeans to their own advantage. So Europeans relied heavily on local intermediaries and interpreters to help them rule the population. So often, the people who had been the traditional upper class, traditional elites, whether it be Indian princes or Muslim emirs or African chiefs from ruling families, found that they could hold on to some of their old power by actually cooperating with the colonial regime. So, for Europeans, this gave their regimes a little more legitimacy in the eyes of the public. So, using old local rulers as intermediaries was a common pattern in the 19th century. For example, French West Africa is a territory 8 times larger than France. There was a local population of 15 million by the late 1930s. These 15 million people were ruled by 385 French administrators and 50,000 African chiefs. So, while on one hand there were plenty of oppressed peoples willing to cooperate with their oppressors, there were also a lot of oppressed people that resisted, and rebellions, both big and small, were characteristic of virtually all of the colonial regimes. One of the biggest rebellions against a colonial power happened in India in the years 1857 and 1858, and what sparked it was the British military had produced a machine gun cartridge that was processed using both pig and cow fat. So India is the former Mughal Empire. Its people were Hindus and its people were Muslims. Cows are sacred to Hindus. Pigs are offensive to Muslims. And both Hindus and Muslims saw this as some sort of British conspiracy to undermine their religion and to try to convert them to Christianity. So the rebellion in India was eventually crushed, but relations between the British and the Indian population were much, much worse after this. The new colonial empires dramatically changed the economies in the new colonies. Through the process of colonization, Africa and Asia became more tied in, more integrated, and more dependent on the world economy than ever before. Traditional ways of working were turned upside down all over the colonial world. We see this dramatic move away from subsistence farming, where families produced food for themselves to eat, and a move towards people selling what they farmed or selling their labor for a wage. Colonial governments all over demanded taxation, and subjects had to pay taxes. In order to pay taxes, people had to make money. So taxation really forced people to come into the market economy, whether they wanted to or not. Like in American colonies, forced labor was really a big part of the colonial economies, and colonial powers used forced labor in public works projects to do things like build railroads and build government buildings. In French African colonies, for example, subjugated people were forced to give 10 to 12 days of manual labor per year, and this practice lasted until after the end of the Second World War. In the Congo Free State, which was ruled directly by King Leopold of Belgium, villagers were forced to collect rubber, and when villagers were short, the colonial military would come into the village and commit atrocities against the people. If a village didn't meet the quota of how much rubber they were supposed to collect, the colonial military would execute villagers or mutilate villagers. Often, quotas that weren't met were forced to be repaid by severed hands, and there's a lot of photographic evidence from this. This period in the history of the Congo is known as King Leopold's Reign of Terror, and it lasted for over 20 years, from 1885 to 1908. Throughout the Reign of Terror, the population of the Congo Free State plummeted from 16 to 8 million people, so this was a major historical atrocity comparable to the amount of Jews killed in the Holocaust. Eventually, the atrocities committed in the Congo under Leopold were publicized in Europe, and it was this massive scandal, and the Belgian government had to come in and take direct control over the Congo Free State. In Indonesia, peasants were forced to devote a minimum of 20% of their land to the growing of cash crops, so things like sugar or coffee, and villagers had to pay these crops to the Dutch as tax. So these cash crops made a lot of money for the Dutch, and this allowed the Dutch to industrialize without overtaxing their population at home. But not all growing of cash crops was done through coercion by a colonial power. There were lots of people in Asia and Africa that willingly produced cash crops for the global market long before European colonialism. And they did this because it was profitable to do so. In certain scenarios, colonial rule actually had a very positive impact on the colonized population. And a good example of this is in Burma, which is now known as Myanmar. Before the British took over, the old government didn't allow people to export rice, and the British overturned that rule. The British built better irrigation systems and better transportation within Burma, and this led to a massive population explosion. There was widespread migration from China and India to Burma, and the standard of living improved dramatically. In virtually all African and Asian colonies, the colonizing power set up large-scale European businesses, so big companies owned by Europeans or by Americans or by Japanese. And during this time period, the businesses that were most common were plantations for growing cash crops and mines. So this process of opening mines and opening plantations in the African and Asian colonies is really similar to what happened in the Americas during the early modern era. So by the turn of the 20th century, there were these massive plantations sprouting up all over Southeast Asia. And these plantations were focused on growing typical cash crops, sugar, rubber, tea, tobacco, coffee. In many cases, these plantations were displacing local populations. In 1913, a law in South Africa declared that 88% of the land in South Africa actually belonged to white people, who represented 20% of the population. Much of highland Kenya, which was a rich agricultural region, was taken over by 4,000 white farmers. In many cases, local populations were moved to native reserves. The population reserves were too dense to be self-sufficient, so often natives had no choice but to work on these big European-owned plantations. On top of the plantations, mines became a major source of wage labor. In Malaysia, for example, Malaysia was a British colony. Mining focused on the mining of tin, and by 1895, Malaysia produced 55% of the world's tin. The major mines in South Africa and the Congo were gold and diamond mines, and in these mines, Africans worked unskilled jobs and were paid very little for the work that they did. The best jobs in the gold and diamond mines were reserved for Europeans. So these new big businesses, the plantations and the mines, really brought about the widespread movement of people around Asia and around Africa. People left their homes to work at these plantations and these mines. Plantations in Southeast Asia, for example, attracted poor workers from China and Japan. Often the workers that were being attracted to these plantations had lost their own land to colonial regimes. Tin mines in Malaysia attracted poor Chinese workers, and around the mines they lived in appalling conditions. Diseases due to poor sanitation were epidemic. The work environment was very dangerous. The same can be said for the gold and diamond mines in South Africa and the Congo. On top of people leaving their homes to work on plantations and people leaving their homes to work on mines, a lot of people left their homes to find work in cities. And during this period, we have the growth of many of the biggest cities throughout the colonial world. Places like Nairobi, Cairo, Calcutta, Rangoon, Singapore, Saigon. All these cities really became enormous during this period. These cities were typically crowded, they were unsanitary, they were full of crime, but they attracted people from all over because they were seen as offering opportunities to the poor.